So one of the most compelling stories that's going on right now is the story with the NBA in China. And effectively what happened there is the general manager of the Houston Rockets sent out a tweet that said that he stood with the protesters in Hong Kong. The Chinese government took poorly to that and decided they were going to suspend coverage of the NBA as a result. The NBA then went into damage control mode. And from the US standpoint, we felt as though the NBA going into damage control mode there and not standing up for what Daryl Morey had said was the wrong thing to do. But then from the Chinese side, they felt like the NBA didn't push hard enough. So they even furthered the discipline against the NBA and really brought up this idea of what role does the U.S. have, or at least U.S. companies have, if they're going into China in terms of how they want to handle themselves and how they want to handle their values. The NBA in particular, and I think a reason why the NBA is getting so much crap for this, whereas other U.S. companies who go into China don't, is that the NBA went out of their way to say that they were going to be a league where their players would be more than just athletes. They allowed them to talk crap about America. They allowed them to talk crap about Trump. And so if you're going to brand yourself as the league that lets your players and the people who are part of it get into social activism, you can't hide and then threaten to fire one of your key members if they're going to start speaking up against human rights abuses in China. So for companies like the UFC, where that's not really the case, where they aren't really known for pushing social advocacy, it's not surprising that they're not getting the same crap as the NBA would. And I think what the NBA is getting is fair, but it does bring into question if these companies are worried about losing favor with China and they're making a lot of money in China, is that necessarily a bad thing? So I brought up this article here. It's a month old now at this point. It feels like with the UFC, every time there's a new fight, people forget about the ones that happened weeks ago. It really wasn't that long ago that Weili Zhang became the first Chinese UFC champion, and there's a lot of talk about her becoming a gigantic superstar as a result. The UFC picking up business in China, making a lot of growth there. They had the UFC Performance Center that was being built out there. And now with this news with the NBA, I think it's a decent time to revisit it and just look at what it is they're doing, and do we think it's okay what they're doing? Is it just kind of like in this gray space, and go from there? So we'll read through the article. So it starts off saying, Ari Emanuel's mixed martial arts entertainment company is banking on a new champion to double its profits in China, the Post has learned. This is the New York Post. The Ultimate Fighting Championship, known for brutal matches with skilled fighters and everything from boxing to Taekwondo. Well, that's not really what it's known for. Taekwondo isn't all that popular, but hey, this is the New York Post. This isn't an actual MMA site. But they're saying is negotiating a new media rights deal in China years before its current one expires, in hopes that now's the time to extract more money, industry sources said. It's saying the negotiations come as Weili Zhang, who was born in China, was crowned the champion. The current media rights deal that was struck in 2016 was a 5-year, $50 million deal, so that'd be 5 years at $10 million a year. And now the UFC is seeking to double that. So they'd be looking for $20 million a year for TV rights in China. And they're holding talks with PPTV Sports, as well as tech giants like Alibaba and Tencent, which offer streaming services in China. It says, despite increasingly intense trade war between the U.S. and China, U.S. sports teams and leagues are salivating to sell in China, where demand for U.S. sports is becoming increasingly profitable. Again, remember, this is before the NBA controversy. And as the Post reported in August, Tencent in July agreed to pony up $1.5 billion, triple the previous price of $500 million for a 5-year expansion for its existing rights deal with the NBA. So there you have the numbers for the NBA. Is Tencent's paying $1.5 billion for the NBA. So as far as the NBA going after Daryl Morey, this is a really complicated story in that there's two fronts to it. There's the front where it's like the NBA is saying that they're all about social justice, and now they're backing off of social justice with Daryl Morey. So in that way, they deserve to be criticized. On the other hand, if you do work for a business and that business decides that it's going to operate in another country, would it be wise to speak out against that other country if it risks a lot of money for that business? In that case, no. It's possible that if this deal gets voided, that Daryl Morey's tweet couldn't effectively lead to a chain of events that cost the company $1.5 billion. And generally, if you cost your company $1.5 billion, that's a pretty fireable offense. As far as whether or not a company should be doing business in countries like China, where they're not exactly holding the best human rights, they don't have the best history of human rights, that's where it gets a little bit tough for me. And I think the reason why it gets tough for me is because of another example in the NBA where they decided to pull an all-star game out of North Carolina, so pulled out of an actual state in the United States, because they felt like there were some human rights issues there. And that specific human rights issue was that transgenders were, by law, if you were born male but you transitioned to female, you would have to use a male restroom. So the NBA felt, hey, that's too far. We're going to limit our business in North Carolina over that. So if that's how you want to do business, where something like a transgender bathroom bill is enough for you to pull out or to change your habits, then yeah, I don't think you really should be in a place like China. The UFC, they don't really get involved in that kind of stuff. So for them, with them being in China, I don't know that it's morally wrong for them to be there. Obviously, they were just in Abu Dhabi. There's plenty of issues out there as well. Is it a U.S. company's job to say, hey, we're only going to do business in the U.S. or other countries who share all of the same values that we do? To me, that's tricky. And I feel like if that's how we wanted to do things, a lot of our companies would really be isolated in a way, and it wouldn't exactly be the best thing for us. While it is good that a company keeps American values in mind and makes a product that keeps American values in mind, it's not necessarily the worst thing for a U.S. company to go to another country, make a bunch of money, and have that money come back to the U.S. So in that way, there's value there. So for me, I don't know that I have a strong stance on the NBA. One, I think is pretty obvious, at least on the side of the argument where it's like you can't be the social justice league and then back off of it here with China. But if you're like the UFC and you never were a social justice league, you never went out of your way to be political. I mean, even if you look at the top UFC fighters, and there's a lot of different personalities, there really aren't that many political personalities. Like the most political personality I can think of at the top of the UFC would be Colby Covington, but he's not really that political in that when what he talks about is specifically Trump, as in the individual. It's not like Colby's promos are about like building a wall. It's more so it's just I like Trump and here's how much I like Trump. So it's more of like a personality thing with him than it is like actually talking about specific issues. Like so for the UFC, if they want to be in China, at least on the hypocritical side with the social justice, that's not there for them. Is it right for them to do business there? I would hope that you don't see a Chinese influence where they're changing the product and changing it for Americans to make the Chinese happy. But at this point, I don't see any indication that they have done that. So for me, at this point, yes, it's an interesting story. It's a story that I'd like to see how it develops. It's not just the NBA now that's in this sort of controversy. South Park just did an episode where they completely made fun of the Chinese influence on Hollywood. So we'll see if that has any effect on the UFC in the future. If it starts to have an effect, I think at that point there may be some room for a complaint, maybe some room to expect better of the UFC. But at this point, I don't feel like there's any sort of like Chinese censorship that's been involved in the UFC product. I feel like what I'm getting is right along the lines of what I want, but also right along the lines of what I have been getting, and the changes that have been made have generally been for the better. So at this point, I'm not super concerned, but I think there's a potential in the future where things could get a little bit iffy, especially if that $50 million contract moves up to $100 million and $100 million raises from there. They have more interest there where they feel like it's a greater risk to do something that might upset the Chinese censors or to do something that might have risked that business. So at this point, I think it's something to keep your eye on. I think that's why I did the video here, at least just something to be aware of in a story that could be developing. But at this point, I don't know that I have a strong opinion either way on the UFC being involved in China and in them building the performance centers out there and them pushing Wei Li Zhang now that she's a champion there and them trying to make more money on TV deals out there. Don't know if there's anything necessarily immoral about it, but we've seen with other companies that are doing business in China where things tend to cross that line, and there is a risk with the UFC being involved here that they could possibly do that in the future too. So just something to keep an eye on.